A war veteran returns to his peaceful mountain cabin, only to find it hijacked by a suburban HOA claiming it as public land. What follows is madness, sabotage, and the courtroom battle of the year. As spring surrendered to summer, the winding roads of the Colorado highlands began to thaw and breathe again. Birds returned to their perches, wildflowers erupted in technicolor brilliance, and the distant snowcaps shrank to ragged outlines. Along a secluded trail cut through pine and aspen stood a cabin, not just any cabin, but his cabin. Thomas Gray, 44 years old, Army veteran, historian, and a writer with a weathered journal always within reach, eased his truck up the familiar gravel path. Windows down, the smell of resin and earth washing over him. The home, passed down from his grandfather, a weather-beaten stone and cedar hunting lodge perched defiantly on the slope, waited for him like an old friend. Thomas didn't live here year-round. Between lectures, book deadlines, and the solitude that sometimes ached too loud, he spent most of the year in the city. But for 5 months out of 12, this mountain home was his sanctuary. He maintained it meticulously, cleaned the gutters, winterized the plumbing, kept the surveillance cameras running even when he wasn't there. Property taxes were paid on time. The house was legally registered, insured, and mapped on every county record. Everything was in order, just as it had always been. But something was off the moment he rounded the last bend. His gate was gone. The rustic wooden fence, custom-built by his grandfather decades ago and repaired by Thomas himself, had been stripped from the border. A new sign stood in its place, shiny, metal, and horrifically out of place. It read, Community Recreation Area, property of Foothill Ridge HOA. Thomas blinked. He stepped out of the truck, heart hammering, eyes scanning. Picnic tables, new picnic tables, were set up beneath the pines. A charcoal grill stood on what used to be his firewood platform. Children squealed in delight as they ran through his yard, one kicking a soccer ball dangerously close to the porch railing. A couple lounged in camping chairs on his front steps, sipping lemonade. And there, parked boldly, across the gravel path leading up to his door, was a sleek SUV, someone else's. He approached slowly, every movement tight with disbelief. No vandalism, no forced entry. This wasn't some rogue party. This was organized, deliberate, as if someone had claimed his land as open space, and no one had thought to question it. Inside the mailbox, which had been moved and repainted with a little Foothill Ridge Welcome Committee sticker on it, was an envelope. Neatly typed. HOA letterhead. He tore it open, fingers trembling. Dear Mr. Gray, due to prolonged vacancy exceeding 180 days per calendar year and in accordance with Foothill Ridge Community Development Guidelines, parcel number C814 has been designated as unoccupied common use land under temporary easement status for neighborhood benefit. Thank you for your understanding. Sincerely, Karen Beckett. President, Foothill Ridge, HOA. Thomas laughed, once sharp and humorless. It echoed into the trees, startling a squirrel off the porch railing. Then he crumpled the letter in his fist, stepped around the children on his lawn, and walked toward his house, not yet realizing he was about to enter the most absurd and infuriating fight of his life. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He sat in the creaky armchair near the cold hearth, surrounded by the scent of pine and dust, and a rage so quiet it hummed in his ears. The cabin, his grandfather's legacy, his own refuge, had been invaded, not with torches and pitchforks, but with community cookouts, laminated notices, and recycled wood benches stamped Foothill Ridge HOA. It wasn't vandalism, it was bureaucracy at its most grotesque. By morning, he was on the phone. He called the number listed on the HOA letterhead. The line clicked. A saccharine voice answered. Foothill Ridge Homeowners Association, Karen speaking. Thomas wasted no time. This is Thomas Gray. I own the cabin off Ridgeback Trail. I just arrived and found your sign on my gate, or where my gate used to be. A pause. Then that same artificially pleasant tone. Ah, yes, Mr. Gray. I was hoping you'd call. We've been monitoring that parcel for a while now. Monitoring? He repeated, stunned. Well, not personally, but it became clear that the property wasn't in consistent use. As per community policy, land unoccupied for more than 180 days a year can be reclassified as shared use for the benefit of the neighborhood. I'm not part of your community, he snapped. You border it, Karen replied sweetly. And when land isn't being used, well, it's wasteful, especially when so many families are eager for outdoor space. We've already held 2 yoga classes and a garden club meeting there. It's private property. Karen sighed like a mother explaining why crayons shouldn't be eaten. Mr. Gray, with all due respect, your property doesn't reflect the evolving vision of Foothill Ridge. The aesthetics are rustic, let's say. Your fencing was deteriorating. The landscaping was unmanaged, and frankly, it wasn't welcoming. As part of our beautification initiative, we integrated your lot into our outdoor community plan. He nearly dropped the phone. You beautified it? By tearing down my fence and letting strangers barbecue on my front porch? Oh, no one's on the porch anymore. We had a request to shift picnic access after someone tripped on a nail. Thomas was about to explode when she added, quite matter-of-factly, and since you don't contribute to HOA dues, don't participate in community meetings, and haven't made any improvements in the past 5 years, the board voted unanimously to pursue easement status with the county. You'll find that it's all quite within reason. His voice dropped, cold and razor-sharp. I have a deed, a registered title. I pay full taxes. I have boundary surveys and filings with the county. I've done nothing wrong. Karen's tone remained maddeningly unbothered. Possession isn't the issue. It's stewardship, Mr. Gray, and the board has determined that you haven't acted as a good steward of your land. But don't worry. If you're open to compromise, we'd be happy to discuss converting part of your structure into a seasonal community retreat center. Perhaps a shared cabin for HOA guests? It could be lovely. Thomas hung up mid-sentence. He stared at the receiver like it might melt in his palm. A shared cabin. On land his grandfather built with his own 2 hands, a place where Thomas had scattered some of his wife's ashes after her funeral. And now, these people, these strangers, with color-coded lawn regulations, were suggesting he turn it into a damned retreat for HOA brunches. Later that day, he found 3 neighborhood kids digging up his vegetable bed to plant communal lavender. One of them wore an HOA volunteer badge made from construction paper. His porch light had been swapped for a solar-powered lantern, aesthetic compliance, and someone had spray-chalked Community First on the side of his shed. And then came the email, a formal document signed by the HOA board notifying him that if he attempted to reclaim, gate, or obstruct the now public space, he could be subject to disciplinary action under the Expanded Community Use Act, including, according to their legal interpretation, potential revocation of private property rights via petition to the county council. Disciplinary action for standing on his own damn land. Thomas stood in the center of his yard, watching as a neighbor calmly unfolded a camping chair on the edge of his garden and cracked open a kombucha. There was only one thing he knew for sure. This was war. The days that followed were a descent into absurdity. What began as surreal quickly spiraled into something more sinister and far more organized. Thomas had dealt with chaos before in war zones and classrooms alike, but nothing had prepared him for the weaponized pettiness of a suburban HOA on a self-righteous mission. First came the infrastructure. A team of chipper volunteers from the HOA's Green Vision Subcommittee arrived uninvited early one morning, wearing matching t-shirts and armed with measuring wheels and clipboards. They were mapping out eco-zones, one of which included Thomas's driveway, which they claimed was ideal for overflow parking during HOA events. One young man had the gall to ask him if he could move his truck, because it was blocking pedestrian flow. Then came the improvements. Within 48 hours, Thomas's hand-built wooden archway, lovingly carved by his grandfather, had been replaced by a faux stone entry sign that read, "Foothill Ridge Scenic Trail, East Node." The sign was bolted directly into the stone wall beside his mailbox, now repainted again, this time featuring a QR code linked to the HOA's event calendar. A laminated notice on his porch invited him to join us for Smoothie Sunday Yoga and Crystal Alignment, hosted by Lainey and Trish. His security cameras, which he had hardwired into the eaves, were either removed, covered with flower baskets, or knocked off entirely. One camera feed showed a middle-aged man on a stepladder whistling a Taylor Swift song as he installed a wind chime where the motion sensor used to be. The HOA later claimed it was aesthetic realignment, referencing Clause 4.2 of their Community Serenity Plan. Thomas tried to assert control. He set up temporary barriers, simple orange construction cones, to discourage intrusion. The next morning, he woke to find them rearranged into the shape of a smiley face with a paper sign attached. "Let joy in, Mr. Gray," the welcome committee. And then there was the actual sabotage. Children continued to play on his lawn, but now they were part of an organized youth nature club with clipboards and scavenger hunts. One group gleefully rediscovered a bird bath Thomas had built years ago and promptly painted it neon green. Teens used his woodshed roof as a stage for TikTok dances. A golden retriever that didn't belong to anyone specifically became a regular porch sleeper. The final straw was the unsanctioned HOA barbecue, advertised online as a grill and chill in the pines, scheduled squarely on his back patio. He saw it listed in a Facebook event shared over 200 times. He hadn't been invited. He hadn't even been notified. When he confronted a particularly smug man flipping burgers on his grill, a stainless steel Weber purchased with his first teaching bonus, the man replied, "Oh, I thought this was one of those community installations." Karen said it was all part of the new plan. The new plan was now being referenced in multiple HOA newsletters, each one more deranged than the last. One edition featured a map showing integrated greenways, which included Thomas's entire property, now labeled Lot 0, Heritage Commons. Another newsletter praised the generous spirit of absent landholders, subtly referring to Thomas as if he were some benevolent ghost who had gifted his land to the cause of neighborly unity. Police visits became routine. Thomas reported the trespassing, the vandalism, the property destruction, but the officers always arrived sheepish, unsure of their authority. One rookie officer actually said, "Well, technically, if the HOAs filed a public use petition, this could be a gray zone." "No pun intended," he added, with an apologetic smile. Thomas stopped smiling altogether. In an act of rebellion, he erected a temporary fence around the cabin using zip ties and plastic sheeting. It lasted all of 6 hours before someone cut it down and replaced it with colorful bunting. A banner stretched across his porch by sunset. Happy Inclusion Week. Even local wildlife was disturbed. A raccoon that used to raid his compost had apparently relocated, replaced by a miniature community garden planted without permission next to his shed. It was labeled Open Pollination Experiment Zone 3. He found a small scarecrow wearing his old flannel shirt. He hadn't even noticed it missing. One neighbor, a man named Steve with an unnatural tan and permanent Bluetooth earpiece, had the nerve to accuse Thomas of being hostile to community values after Thomas asked him not to pee behind his woodshed during a nature walk. Thomas didn't respond. He just stared at him. Long enough that Steve eventually muttered something about toxic masculinity and wandered off. The HOA, meanwhile, doubled down. Karen sent another letter, this one with formal legal language, notifying Thomas that a petition had been submitted to the County Land Use Committee, requesting reclassification of his property as neglected easement space, citing lack of full-time occupancy, aesthetic disharmony, and insufficient contribution to communal lifestyle. They even attached a fabricated neglect and transition report, which claimed, among other things, that the home had no permanent lighting, unregulated wildlife activity, and a non-compliant energy aura. Aura, Thomas muttered aloud, sitting alone in his grandfather's rocking chair as the sun set. He could hear ukuleles playing in the distance, a sound he now loathed with every fiber of his being. That night, he ordered a motion sensor sprinkler system online. Then he called a lawyer, because now it wasn't just about fences, grills, or wind chimes. It was about the principle, and someone was going to pay. Thomas Gray had always been a man of patience, taught to keep his cool under pressure, to analyze before acting. But there was a point when absurdity outgrew restraint, and that point was crossed somewhere between the ukulele jam sessions and the flamingo-shaped solar lights planted in his rhubarb patch. The gloves were coming off. The first call he made was to Jean Moreno, a sharp-tongued property rights attorney with a resume full of HOA scalps and a voice like someone who chewed nails for breakfast. She didn't flinch when Thomas recounted the situation. In fact, she laughed. "Ah, Foothill Ridge," she said. "I have had the pleasure. They tried to annex a fire station once. Let's scorch some earth." Jean hit the ground running. Within 48 hours, she filed a cease and desist letter to the HOA, citing property deed violations, unlawful trespass, destruction of private assets, and, her personal favorite, intentional community-induced delusion of jurisdiction. That was only the beginning. Thomas, meanwhile, began turning his cabin into a fortress of evidence. He installed new, weatherproof cameras, this time well hidden and cloud-synced. Within a week, he compiled hours of footage. HOA volunteers tearing down fences, children spray-painting smiley faces on his shed under adult supervision. Karen herself leading what she called a silent mindfulness hike directly through his vegetable garden. He posted a few clips online. They went viral. A local news station reached out for an interview. Thomas obliged. The segment aired under the title, HOA Versus. Homeowner, can you steal a cabin with yoga? Viewership skyrocketed. Comments flooded in. This is why I live in a van. Karen energy is off the charts. Plot twist. He's actually squatting in her yard. Public sentiment was on Thomas's side, but Jean wanted more than sympathy. She needed proof of corruption. Enter the HOA's digital footprint. Jean's team subpoenaed internal emails through a discovery motion after filing a preliminary injunction to block further development on Thomas's land. And there, buried in the HOA board's Gmail logs, was gold. An email from Karen to the HOA landscaping coordinator, time-stamped 3 months prior. He only comes in the summer. If we start early enough, it'll look abandoned by the time he gets back. Leave the fence down. No one's gonna notice. We'll say it was rotted. I want this park done before Memorial Day. Another gem surfaced shortly after, this time sent to a board member. He doesn't belong here. It's a dead man's cabin. If he cared, he'd live in it full time. Let's claim it. That. The smoking gun. But Jean wasn't done. Through a contact in the county assessor's office, she discovered the neglect and transition report, the very one used to justify the HOA's public use petition, was attached to a document bearing a forged signature of a retired land inspector. The inspector was now 72, living in Arizona, and very confused when contacted. "I haven't signed anything in years," he told Jean, "especially not about community vibes." With those documents in hand, Jean filed a lawsuit in county court: trespass, defamation, fraud, attempted theft of property, and emotional distress. The number was loud: $200,000 in damages plus court costs. HOA board members were individually named. Karen responded by releasing a newsletter to residents titled, "We Are the Real Victims: How a Recluse is Threatening Our Peace." It included a photo of Thomas's truck, captioned, "Possibly unregistered." Jean framed it on her office wall. That weekend, Thomas erected a brand new perimeter fence, steel-reinforced posts, motion sensor alarms, and floodlights that flicked on with theatrical flair. He installed a speaker system wired to a motion alert that calmly announced, "You are trespassing on private land. The property owner is armed with lawyers." No one came near the garden after that, except one guy, a teenage boy in a crop top and glow stick necklace, who wandered in, arms outstretched, whispering, "I'm one with the earth." Thomas watched from his porch. Sprinklers engaged. The kid shrieked and bolted. The HOA's grip on the area was slipping, and fast. Residents began whispering. Some even sent anonymous apology notes. One was written on pastel stationery with glittery ink. "Sorry for the gnome. Karen made us." Thomas folded it neatly and smiled for the first time in weeks. This wasn't just defense anymore. Now it was retaliation. 3 months later, the courtroom was packed like a Friday night diner in a blizzard. Every seat filled, every neck craned. Locals had caught wind of the case from social media and news outlets, dubbing it the Mountain Cabin War. Even the court clerk seemed more excited than usual, as if she'd finally been given the starring role in a legal soap opera. Cameras weren't allowed, but sketches from the gallery would later go viral, including one of Karen mid-eye roll captioned "Queen." Dean of the HOA Rebellion. Thomas sat beside Jean, freshly shaven, wearing a tailored jacket he hadn't put on since his last book signing. His hands were steady, his expression calm, but inside he was a live wire stretched taut. This wasn't about pride. This was about a principle older than any HOA bylaws. You do not take what isn't yours. Across from him sat Karen Beckett, flanked by 2 visibly exhausted lawyers. She wore a beige pantsuit that screamed reasonable leadership, though her expression was closer to entitled monarch denied throne. She dabbed her lips with a monogrammed napkin as if waiting for brunch. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s with reading glasses and no time for nonsense, opened the proceedings. Jean stood, her voice cool and deliberate. "Your Honor, we are here because my client, Mr. Gray, is the lawful owner of a mountain property that has, over the course of less than 6 months, been invaded, altered, rebranded, and publicly advertised as communal land by a homeowners association that has no legal jurisdiction over it. What began as a neighborly oversight has escalated into an organized and fraudulent land grab." Karen's lead attorney objected to the phrase, "land grab." The judge overruled him with a glance that could peel wallpaper. The evidence presentation was a buffet of HOA horror. Security footage, showing Karen personally directing volunteers to dismantle Thomas's fence, and at one point, stopping to pose for a photo beside the removed gate like she'd won a contest. A copy of the newsletter celebrating the integration of Lot 0 into the community plan, with Thomas's property photos used without permission. testimony from a landscaper hired by the HOA, who admitted, under oath, that he was paid cash and told, "Don't ask questions, just clear space for benches." And finally, the cherry on top, a live video call with the retired inspector whose signature had been forged. He leaned into the camera, squinting. "That's my name, sure. But I didn't sign that. And I never said anything about an energy aura. What even is that?" Karen tried to defend herself on the stand, but Jean masterfully dissected her testimony like a surgeon working with a scalpel made of sarcasm. "You stated Mr. Gray's home was aesthetic blight. Can you elaborate on what code that violates?" "Well, it doesn't match the beige theme." "Is beige theme a recognized legal standard in Colorado Landmannstation?" Karen's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "It's common sense?" Jean nodded politely. "So, just to confirm, your governing principle was beige-based common sense?" The court stenographer snorted, loudly. Karen's defense crumbled like gluten-free crackers in a hailstorm. By the time closing arguments rolled around, even the HOA board members in attendance looked like they were reconsidering their life choices. One was caught doodling, "I want to resign," on his notepad. The judge adjourned briefly, then returned with a verdict so swift it seemed rehearsed. The court finds that Foothill Ridge HOA, under the direction of Miss Beckett, engaged in unauthorized occupation, property defacement, document falsification, and public misrepresentation of ownership. This was not confusion. This was calculated encroachment. Karen froze. Her attorney blinked at the floor. The judgment: $200,000 in damages to Thomas Gray for property restoration, legal costs, and emotional distress. A permanent injunction barring the HOA from contacting, referencing, or stepping foot on Thomas's land. And, most deliciously, criminal charges for Karen: forgery, trespassing, and obstruction of land registry processes. She gasped, turning toward the board members. "You're not going to let this happen, are you?" One board member leaned sideways and muttered, "We voted to throw you under the bus 2 days ago." A week later, the HOA was placed under state supervision. Karen was removed as president, her access to all official documents revoked. Her farewell email to the community included the line, "He may have won the case, but he'll never be part of the vision." Thomas read it while sipping tea on his porch, smiling softly. He wasn't part of the vision. He was the boundary. The courtroom had long emptied, but the aftershocks rippled through Foothill Ridge like a dropped wine glass at a garden party. The judgment didn't just hit the HOA's wallet, it detonated its foundation. By the end of the week, the neighborhood's beloved beige uniformity began cracking like old stucco. Residents who had once proudly displayed their Foothill Ridge's family signs in front yards were now scrubbing them off with citrus cleaner and shame. Karen Beckett vanished from public view. Rumor had it she fled to Scottsdale to focus on healing and curated air. Her home, once the epicenter of HOA micromanagement, now stood dark, the motion sensor lights eerily still, the porch gnome wearing a black mourning ribbon. One resident claimed she'd seen Karen at the gas station buying off-brand soda and muttering "Aura this" under her breath. Thomas, meanwhile, did not celebrate, at least not in the expected sense. He wasn't the victory dance type. His version of triumph was quieter, walking across his now fenced property at sunset, replacing broken lanterns, sanding the deck rail his grandfather built, sipping coffee in the early hours without worrying about a jogger setting up a yoga mat in his driveway. Still, small tributes appeared. Neighbors, cautiously, sheepishly, began reaching out. A loaf of homemade sourdough arrived in a brown paper bag with a note. "For what it's worth, I voted against the lavender garden. Sorry about your tomatoes. Another envelope slid under his gate included a Polaroid of a child's birthday party on his old fire pit site, circled in red with, "Didn't know it was your fire pit. My bad." And then came the HOA meeting. Technically, Thomas wasn't invited. He was still not a member, nor did he intend to be. But one board member, a weary man named Dennis, who had aged 10 years over the course of the lawsuit, requested his presence. Just to clarify some boundaries, literally. The room was awkward. Plastic chairs squeaked, pastries sat untouched. Zhang came too, uninvited but welcome. She leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, radiating legal authority. Thomas stood at the front, not angry, not smug, just tired and firm. "I didn't start this," he said simply. "I asked for peace, not war. I never wanted my home to be part of your plans. I just wanted it left alone. That's all I still want." He paused, then added, "You don't get to redraw someone else's property line because you find it inconvenient. This isn't a coloring book." The silence was broken by scattered applause, and from the back, someone yelled, "Preach!" That night, Thomas returned to the cabin. He opened his laptop for the first time in weeks and began typing again. Something not about bylaws or lawsuits. Just a story. About the land, the woods, and a man who stood his ground. And outside, under a clean sky and a very secure fence, the property finally exhaled. Peace, it seemed, had been reclaimed. But there was still one more chapter to come, and it would be unexpected, noisy, and entirely too cheerful. The following weekend, Thomas was preparing to settle into a quiet afternoon with his coffee and a tattered Faulkner paperback when the rumble of a diesel engine shattered the mountain calm. He stepped onto the porch, mug in hand, just in time to see a massive white tour bus pull up to the base of his freshly installed steel gate. Painted across the side in whimsical font were the words, "Urban Living Enthusiasts Club, Scenic Property Tours." Below that, in smaller script, featuring legendary HOA battlefields. The doors hissed open, and out stepped a woman in a straw hat and a headset mic. "All right, folks," she chirped with unnatural brightness. "This next stop is what we call the Line in the Pines." This is where one man, yes, a real veteran, stood up to suburban tyranny and said, "No means HOA, hell no." Thomas blinked. For a split second, he considered going back inside, but curiosity, and the utter ridiculousness of the moment, got the better of him. A crowd of eager retirees in breathable vests and matching lanyards spilled out, snapping photos of his fence, his mailbox, his gnome. One woman zoomed in on his private property, "No HOA trespassing" sign, and whispered reverently, "Powerful." "Sir," the guide called, spotting him, "would you mind answering a few questions for our group?" Thomas raised his cup. "Only if I get royalties." They laughed. Someone offered him a muffin. Another handed him a laminated card to sign marked HOA Survivor Series, Volume 3. He stared at it for a beat, then signed, "To the brave few who stayed beige-free, TG." The guide beamed. "He's so grounded, you can just feel the boundary enforcement energy." After a brief Q&A, during which Thomas diplomatically dodged a question about whether Karen had joined a cult, the group reboarded the bus. As it rolled away, one woman shouted from the back window, "You're a legend, Tom!" He wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry, so he did both, quietly, then went back inside and made another cup of coffee. Later that night, as the sun dipped below the ridgeline, Thomas replaced the old gate sign with something new, something custom engraved, solid oak, hand-finished. It read, "Welcome to Gray's End. Private property, no HOA, no yoga, no kombucha, ever." And beneath it, carved in sharp, neat letters, "I only live here part-time, but I win full-time." He stepped back, admired the sign, and grinned. And for the first time all summer the woods were still, the porch was quiet, and the wind, blessed, pine-scented wind, carried no sound of ukuleles, only peace, and maybe, just maybe, a hint of victory-flavored lemonade.